Kia ora everyone, I'm John Campbell. Welcome to Ask One News. Thank you so much for joining us. I've just come back from a roadie, John Campbell's budget roadie in the far north. And these are your questions in response to that. That's a very good question. And I also like it when people ask us to explain why we're doing things. I think that journalism needs to explain itself more often. So thank you for that question. Why did we choose Northland? Well, we chose Northland because we measure deprivation in this country. And so in order to understand what services need to be provided around health, around education, we measure deprivation. And by many of the deprivation measures, Northland is doing the least well of any area in the country. Now, it's not the only area with measurable deprivation. In fact, there are quite a few. But Northland is lowest on a scale of 1 to 20. It's 20, for example, in household income. It's 20, for example, in education outcomes. So that means it's last, which means that a lot of kids in Northland are leaving schools young with little or no qualifications. And so we're able to measure this stuff. But also I think there's something else about Northland, and I experienced it. I shot a documentary with a brilliant cameraman, Andy Dalton, in Tairāwhiti last year. And that's a similar community. It's a bloody long way from anywhere. And it's disproportionately Māori relative to the rest of the country, and disproportionately low income relative to the rest of the country. And there is a sense in these communities now that they feel less seen. So if people feel less seen, the job of journalism is to shine light into those corners and go and talk to them. So the people who are most seen in this country probably work on or near Lambton Quay. Second most seen in this country probably work in central Auckland. And then if you're watching this in Southland, you'll be saying, what about us? And so the further you get from Wellington, but also the more Māori a population becomes, the more low income a population becomes, the less it feels like they have access to power structures. They have access to Wellington. When I talk about Wellington, it's important you understand if you live in Wellington, I'm not talking about the city, I'm talking about, power, parliament, the beehive, government. And so the North does poorly on many deprivation measures. It feels really disconnected from Wellington. And also it's a beautiful place to visit, and we got some great pictures, so that's why we went there. Jane, that's a wonderful question. What happens if governments don't stick to their budgets? And I have been covering politics off and on for 30 years. Budgets are often not what we expect. The government opens its books. We know what position the government is in. We know how much income they have. We know how much they spend. We know their debt levels. But the budget is about a government's subjective, particular and individual prioritisation. This is what's important to us. And that's why often when governments change, budgets change. But by and large, you know more or less what a budget is going to contain in advance. You don't have the details. So we don't have the details. And the devil is in the details. And this government wants to give tax cuts in some form. We don't know how big they will be, and we don't know who will get them. But they are adamant that the tax cuts won't be funded by debt. I think there'll be smoke and mirrors there. But they're also making cuts. We've seen job losses in the civil service, but there will be other cuts, other tweaking too. So they take it with one hand, give with the other. It's a balancing act. But by and large, government budgets are reasonably consistent with how they describe themselves. And because we've had an election reasonably recently, only the end of last year, we kind of know roughly what to expect from this government. So Peter's question about why people want more control, more local control of how public money is spent, arises from something in our John Campbell's budget roadie when we went to the far north. And so thanks for watching it, Peter, or reading it. I really appreciate it. And so the mayor of the far north, whose name is Moko Te Pānea, Mayor Moko talks about a thing called localism, but he wasn't the only person. He was the only person who used that word in our story.
We've got a word for that now in local government. It's called localism. I know I won't be alone. I know that the other 66 mayors of this country will also stand up and preach the power of localism and the devolution of power and being able to make decisions on the ground for our communities and for our people and doing a better job at it.
But he wasn't the only person who talked about a greater buy local for local. And there is an increasing sense that central government prescriptions, which are often generally one size fits all, don't always fit the same populations. So I don't know, let's think about where I grew up. I grew up on Mount Vic, Roseneath in Wellington, right? Went to Roseneath School. That is a very different population from the population I saw in Kaitaia when we were shooting up there. It's a very different population from if you're watching this in Gore. It's a completely different population again. And yet central government essentially prescribes a big blanket policy that we throw over the whole country and administer from Wellington. Now that's not always the case. There are tweaks and there are regional policy manifestations, but by and large it's a one-size-fits-all template. And what they're saying in the north, and I suspect that there will be people watching this in other parts of the country who are saying, actually that one size doesn't fit us. And what Moko Tupani is saying is, don't spend the money up here. You don't even know what you're doing. Give it to us. And actually, and there will be metrics attached to that. If we don't get it right, we will be voted out. If we don't get it right, we live in these communities. They see us every day. You know, the overwhelming number of people in the far north, or in Gore, or in Tairāwhiti, are never going to meet a cabinet minister in their lives. But they will be able to see their mayor if they need to. So Moko Tupani is saying, we're happy to be accountable, but we think we'll do a better job of spending the same amount of money that you are already spending. We know where the need is. And so this is this increasing movement towards a kind of localism. And from the roadie, that was the thing I was most struck by, how many people were saying, trust us, because actually what you're doing at the moment ain't working. We think we can do it better. So great question, Peter, thank you. Lisa, I think that's an incredibly pressing question. And so Lisa's asking about farmer resilience to weather events, and what we know is that there are going to be more and more weather events, because the thing about climate change is that it's an increase of extremes, right? So it's an increase of Gabrielle type events, it's an increase of droughts, it's an increase of flooding, nightmare, right? If you're trying to grow crops, for example, what, do you grow crops at like a lot of water? Then you get a drought. Do you grow crops at like no water? Then you get flooding, right? So there's going to be so much more of this. And on the road trip, we spoke to Michelle Ruddle, who is the chair of the Rural Support Trust in the far north. And she identifies herself and she's saying, look, this is what I do. This is my life. So I dairy farm, I do the books on the dairy farm, I raise my children, and also I do rural support. So she's absolutely immersed in the communities. And a bit like an answer I gave before about the growing sense in the far north that they can do things better than central government when it comes to looking after themselves, there's a growing sense of that on the farms too. That there needs to be a greater ability for farmers themselves to prescribe the appropriate responses to things. And what Michelle Ruddle's doing is she's saying, we're doing rural support. So we're working with people who are really up against it. They might have lost their crops. And so what they're trying to do is empower themselves to respond to the communities so that it's more buy local, for local, more people who live amongst them, taking care of them, looking after them, coming to visit them, people who know their stories, people whose children go to school with their children, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So there's real localism coming from the farm, which was really interesting, as well as from Māori, where localism is really, so there's real overlap there, real commonality. But the other thing I think is that Michelle said to me is we just need regulation consistency. And one of the things, and everyone knows with the RMA, for example, the Fast Track Bill, that every time, often when governments change hand, regulation change hands, governance of land use changes hands, changes, so the idea of consents changes, and so farmers are thinking, what regime am I working with now? And they're exhausted by that. But I think what the key message that I learned in Tairāwhiti, and my colleagues learned in Hawke's Bay and Northern and Coromandel afterwards, is we have to be able to respond to weather events. It's no use saying, if you'll forgive my language, shit, it's raining, what are we going to do now? We need to have a fit for purpose plan ready to go. We need to have the people ready to go. You know, mobilisation can't be us scratching our heads and thinking, oh my God, Cyclone Gabrielle, what do we do? Mobilisation has to be preemptive. We have to be ready in advance of the events. And nowhere is that more important, I think, than on farms, right? And communities where they grow our income. The other thing, final point, is roading is crucial. And I kept telling stories about State Highway bloody 2 out of Tairāwhiti Every time there is a major storm, it's closed. What do they do in Tairāwhiti? They grow salad ingredients. Where do we eat the salad ingredients? I eat them in Auckland. What happens if the road is closed and they can't get them from Tairāwhiti to me? The salad ingredients go off. So actually building and resilience is also about building an infrastructural resilience, and that it's going to be fascinating to see how we do that. Tina, the irony of your question about the Mangamuka Gorge Road is I always hated that bloody road because it's windy, windy, windy. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Far North, basically, to use a crass phrase, State Highway 1 goes up the guts, essentially, between Kaikooi and Kaitaia. It just goes up the middle of the country, and it goes through the Mangamuka Gorge. Mangamuka Gorge, no one's fault, huge, huge, huge slips in August 2022. We're now in late May, early June 2024, and the bloody road still isn't open, which means that instead of going up the guts, you've got to go round 10 and then back down to get to Kaitaia, and adds an enormous amount of travel time. Remember also that the trip up from Auckland, the Brynderwyns, just to the north of Auckland, are currently closed, which means you've got to kind of detour off through Waipu and Mangawhai. So all up, there's a lot of extra costs added. And labour, because it takes longer for drivers to get there, and petrol, of course, and in also the fact that goods that are perishable are spending longer in trucks. But the other thing is, and I think we're returning to deprivation levels. This is a big region with small population centres spread far and wide. Children have the right, for example, to play sport, rugby or netball on Saturday morning. And if your son or daughter is playing rugby in Kaikohe and you live in Kaitaia, and you have to go round the long way because State Highway 1 in the Mangamukas is closed, then it's adding time and petrol cost. And this is a community where petrol costs are absolutely critical. You know, they're really impactful. So, in other words, once again, these communities are kind of being penalised for being poor and remote. You know, it's adding salt to the injury, right? And so, we need to build roading resilience. Tairāwhiti wants roading resilience. The West Coast, you know, we've got to build in roading resilience because at some stage that alpine fault is going to go, and we can't have the West Coast cut off from the rest of the country. Northland, we need to build in roading resilience. And I'm not having a go at the contractors who are doing incredible work between, say, Gisborne and Whakatane on State Highway 2. Incredible work. But there's a slip, they go and remove the slip, they pack the wall that slipped, they have hillside that slipped, and then 6 weeks, 6 months, 2 years later, there's another heavy rainfall, and exactly the same place slips again. So we have to build in permanent resilience, and we really need to do it in these remote, poor communities because roading is their lifeline. There ain't no public transport in these places, none of it. So roading is their lifeline. Jamie and Tina, I think we've combined your questions here, and essentially what you're saying is what have previous governments done, and how do we create employment, stimulate the economy, but not do so in a way that creates inflation. And that is the great balancing act of politics, not just in New Zealand, but basically fundamentally everywhere. And so we saw a really good example of it with the COVID stimulus, right? So when we all went into lockdown, Grant Robertson and the Labor government said, gosh, we've got to keep businesses afloat. And so they pumped wage subsidies into the community. And actually, there was a whole lot of extra government money floating around. But not only did they do that, the Reserve Bank, so there's two policies, there's financial policy and there's fiscal policy. One is political, one is what the government does. The other is independent, and it's what the Reserve Bank does. And that's it was charged with keeping unemployment low and keeping inflation in a narrow range. It's now only charged with the unemployment requirement is gone, the net's dropped it. It's now only charged with keeping inflation in a narrow range. So what we had was this, interest rates down, a whole lot of money washing around, people went ka-ching. Bizarrely, in the middle of a pandemic, people were spending up large, and that was inflationary. So inflation means that there is so much money out there that we are competing to buy stuff and we're driving prices up, right? What we're currently seeing is the Reserve Bank's response to that inflation, which is to raise interest rates. Why do they raise interest rates? Because if they raise interest rates, we can afford to borrow less. So if you have a mortgage that costs, if you have a $100,000 mortgage and your interest rate is 2.5%, you're paying $2,500 a year in interest. If it goes up to 6%, you're paying $6,000 a year in interest. You have to get that money from somewhere, right? The extra $3,500, so you spend less. If you spend less, inflation falls. So at the moment we're in that push me, pull you cycle. We've gone from really rampant stimulus to now the Reserve Bank saying, down, down economy, sit, you bad dog, sit. Now, the Nats, well, not just the Nats, the coalition government, actually it's mostly the Nats driving this. ACT aren't that convinced. ACT want the government to behave with fiscal restraint. But the Nats promised us tax cuts. So I know you've already worked this out. Tax cuts theoretically are inflationary because they give people more money. So in an anti-inflation environment where the Reserve Bank is raising interest rates or keeping them up to smash inflation down, the government's going to say, yeah, have a little bit more money. And so this is the balancing act. How do we stimulate the economy? A stimulated economy creates jobs. How do we keep a lid on inflation? And how do we get interest rates down? Because high interest rates aren't really good for anyone except really rich people with a lot of money in the bank. And so this is the balancing act of the government, and by God, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Tapua here, I'm so grateful that you're watching all our work. Choice, I really appreciate it. And Tapu, if you don't mind me calling you that, it's a great question. So, not that long ago, a few weeks ago, we did a series of stories on water infrastructure. So we've gone from 3 waters, which was politically disastrous for the Labour Party, although it was intellectually an acknowledgement of the extent of our water infrastructure debt. Like Tapu, I don't know where you are, but a lot of communities, their water infrastructure is not fit for purpose. In the far north, wastewater, which includes what we flush in our loos, goes into the water in the vast majority of cases from their wastewater plants. So it goes into the Hokiama Harbour, or it goes into rivers. Moko Tapania, the mayor in the far north, said, we don't want to flush our toilets into our kitchen. So we have to tidy up our water infrastructure. The government's response to it is a thing called Local Water Done Well, which is basically the government saying, councils, it's on you, you sort it out. Because water is run by councils, not by central government. The problem with saying councils, you sort it out, is that successive councils over generations haven't sorted it out. Because in order to sort it out, they would have had to have put rates up, and that's not popular. So we now have an infrastructure deficit in water that is staggering, like it's mind-boggling. Let me give you an example. It's estimated that to tidy up the water infrastructure deficit, that is just how shitty their water infrastructure is, in Northland alone, will cost a total of $600 million. Now, their annual budget for everything in Northland is $172 million. Can they get $600 million? Not a bloody chance. Where are they going to get it from? So the government on the one hand has said, sort it out, councils, your water, your infrastructure, you sort it out. Fair point, it is. On the other hand, the councils are saying, we can't afford to. Fair point, they can't. So the government is saying, okay, well, you have to have economies of scale. You have to work with your neighbours. But Northland's neighbour, Auckland, doesn't want to work with them. Auckland's basically quietly saying, you piss off, Northland. We don't want to have anything to do with your shitty, inadequate, heavily indebted water infrastructure. So it's going to be fascinating to see what the budget does here. I think the government was hoping to get away with just saying, councils, over to you. I now think it's apparent that they're not going to be able to pull that off. And after I did that water series, a mayor called me, he was really cross, and said, so the sort of devolution, like go out to the councils, but he says devolution without funding is actually abdication. It's an abdication of responsibility. So it will be interesting to see what the government does, because the councils are saying, we can't afford this. Thanks so much for watching us. We really appreciate the fact that you've watched this far, and also the questions we received. They're really good questions, so we're super grateful. If you want to watch John Campbell's Budget Roadie, which was our trip around the far north, talking to people about precisely these things, then you can go to TVNZ Plus. It's also on YouTube, or you can click up here. The Modern World, God, it's amazing. And I just want to do a shout out to the people who worked on it. Connor, the producer, is sitting over there, the 2 editors, Charlotte and Lydia, who are sitting over there in the dark, because that's how hard times are at TVNZ. And Clint, the cameraman, Clint and I ate a diet that was not approved by the National Heart Foundation. For 5 days we ate fish and chips and pies. And look at me.